Thank you for joining us for our discussion about the geopolitical and military origins of the Cold War. Remember, this is right after World War II ended. Americans were confident and feeling good about themselves that they had just defeated Nazism, totalitarianism, but then they find themselves looking at over their shoulder at their previous ally who has now become their enemy, the Soviet Union. When we hear the term Cold War, we need to think about, remember the fact that thankfully this didn't really become a direct confrontation between the two superpowers. It was indirect. It was a battle of nerves, of diplomacy. There was an arms race. There was espionage. But thankfully, the Soviet Union and the United States themselves never went to war because, of course, that would have been World War III, and that likely could have been a nuclear war and perhaps the last war that we would have ever fought. So the stakes are really high at this time. It's hard for us to underestimate and understand just how scared people were at the time that this could have developed into something much larger. So after World War II, there's really three sides in the world. First is the Soviet Union. They, again, had been our allies during the war, although they were really more of our frenemies. We had in common our opposition to Hitler, right? They were a communist country and had been since the very end of World War One, and they, of course, wanted to spread their government, their way of life worldwide because they thought it was a good idea. The United States, on the other hand, we are the leader of the free world and we want to contain communism. The third aspect of the globe that was really competed over was what we call developing nations. These were the nations where both sides were trying to appeal to get them to really come to our side and adopt our way of life. So at the end of World War II, the big thing to remember is that all of the allies had originally agreed on self determination for former Axis allied countries. Those places would be able to decide for themselves via vote what kind of government they would have. And the two big governments at the time were democracy or communism. Which one would each nation turn to? It probably wasn't a surprise that the Soviet Union would refuse to allow real elections in the countries that they occupied. Remember, at the end or during World War II, both sides were squeezing in on Germany, right? Germany was fighting a two-front war. And where the war stopped, or when the war stopped, where each side was really dictated what those future countries would become. The Soviet Union, they wanted communist countries on their Western front. And in some ways, you can't blame them. If you think about past wars, whether it was Napoleon or Hitler, people had invaded from the west of Russia or the west of the Soviet Union and attacked them. So, from their standpoint, they wanted a buffer zone. And so they created and installed communist governments in the nations you see to the right of the bold line on the map. These are satellite nations, just like a satellite, the moon, or satellites that are in Earth's orbit, right? They're dominated by the larger body. These countries were dominated by the Soviet Union. A key term that comes up more so later on in the Cold War, especially when we talk about Southeast Asia, was the domino theory. If you think about, I'm sure everybody did this when you were younger. Maybe you still do it today. You lay up dominoes, you make some intricate pattern, knock one over, and they all fall, right? Well, that was the fear of the time. That's really what's going to fuel the drive for American containment, that we wanted to stop those dominoes from falling. Germany was unique. Remember, there were four big allies during the war. There were the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets. And at the end of World War II, they all occupied a certain part of Germany, and they administered the government in those parts of Germany. Cool map here that you can see how Germany was divided. And the eventual goal was to reunite Germany into a country that would no longer be a real military threat. The Three allies in the West, the Americans, British, and French, they will agree later on to reunite their parts, but the Soviet Union, Stalin wanted, of course, to keep what he had. The unique thing about it, if you look at the map and really zoom in, it's like, well, look at Berlin. Berlin was the capital of Germany. It was located in the eastern section of Germany, the part that was administered by the Soviet Union. But Berlin itself was also divided into four parts. That'll prevent maybe conflict over who gets the capital, but that will lead to other conflict, as we'll see in just a few slides. So Churchill gives a speech. This is an important vocab word, the Iron Curtain. If you think about a curtain in your home, you can move them, right? You can peek behind the curtains. You can move them out of the way. But an iron curtain, that's not going to move, is it? And so Churchill says that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. On a prior map, it was in bold, but here we can see the brownish color versus the greenish color. And Churchill is saying, right, this iron curtain, people will not be able to get past it. It's really dividing the continent into two, and it will do so for nearly 50 years. Here's a political cartoon of someone being on maybe the wrong side of the curtain. We see people underneath who are trying to escape, but unfortunately are not. And what are these plans for the New World is being debated on the western part of this curtain. Doesn't look so good for what's happening on the other side. Remember, Truman was president. He became president at the end of World War II. He's the one, of course, that decided to drop the bomb on Japan. And in the post-war world, Truman was intent on putting his philosophy on governing, on managing Europe, and hopefully preventing another war, but definitely preventing the spread of communism. And so Truman, his foreign policy comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine. And what he said was that the United States would assist any nation that is opposed to communism. So if communists are looking over their shoulder or knocking on their door or trying to infiltrate their government, the United States will come to their aid to prevent them from falling to communism. So this is an early part of containment. And the two nations you see on the map that are most at risk were Greece and Turkey. They're geographically located right next to other communist nations. So the Truman Doctrine will aid all nations, but specifically it's meant to, at the beginning, to prevent Greece and Turkey from falling to communism. So this idea of containment, of containing the spread of communism, will be America's chief foreign policy goal until the early 1990s. That's a long time. That's decades. Young people today weren't born with communism as a threat, certainly born with other threats in the world, but for people that are in their late 30s and older, the fear of communism was this very real thing that pervaded society, that pervaded culture. Another part of this was the Marshall Plan. If you think about Europe, right, it had been war-torn from 1939 when it started until 1945 when it ended. So that's 6 years of war and destruction that Europeans rained upon themselves. And so the Marshall Plan was another part of foreign policy. And the U.S. says that we're going to come to the economic aid of Europeans to help them rebuild. And of course, you have to think about this from two angles. In one way, it's right, well, we're helping out people, we're helping them rebuild to get back to where they were before. That sounds very altruistic. But on the other side, remember, we want to offer aid to nations that might be tempted to fall to communism. Because if we can offer aid, or if we can offer more aid or better aid than the Soviet Union can, of course, they'll be more likely to take our side. So that's a key thing to think about when we think about the Marshall Plan and containment. There was a lot of debate. This was real money that America was spending. A lot of Americans weren't too sure what to do. But as we can see from this cartoon, we see the bear, the symbol of the Soviet Union, right, of ancient Russia, looming over Western Europe, and the shadow is lengthening. So, of course, America did eventually give this aid, which helped Europe to rebuild. This is kind of a cool picture. If you take a look at it, we can see Stuttgart, Germany. And this image, if you look really closely at the streets where they are, this is a photo taken from the exact same vantage point 8 years apart. So we see in 1947, that's 2 years after the war ended, there were still very little construction done. But because of the Marshall Plan, because of American money that flowed to Germany and other nations, they were able to rebuild. It's kind of a cool picture to think about. Something else to think about, we might think today, oh well, communists, they have a terrible government. Why would anybody pick that as a form of government? But if it's 2 years after the war ended and you don't have medicine, you don't have coal to start a fire in the winter to keep yourself warm, if you don't have food to put into your stomachs, are you really going to be that concerned about the governmental philosophy? Probably not, right? You're going to be more worried about feeding your family, keeping yourself alive. So, this is why the Marshall Plan was so vital to the United States. Here's another image. Again, this is from the same corner in Hamburg. If you look really carefully, you kind of see in the top, and just to a little bit to the left of the map, you can see that one building facade with the peaks is still there. But again, we see a 5-year rebuild in Hamburg to get it back to maybe what it was before the war. So we talked about Germany earlier, and Berlin, the capital, being in the eastern part, in the Soviet-administered part. So this is going to lead to a unique confrontation, and really, this shows the battle of wits that was occurring during the Cold War. So Stalin, right? He's got Berlin, the capital. It's in the communist part in Eastern Germany, but then half of Berlin is more democratic, right? So it's just not a good look for Stalin. It makes him look kind of weak. So he's trying to think of a way, hey, how can I get all of Berlin to myself? He doesn't want to start a war with the British, the French, and the Americans. What can he do? He closes off aid to Berlin. He closes off the roads. He closes off the railroads. He says, Americans, British, French, you cannot send any supplies into West Berlin. His hope is, like we talked about earlier, that he can starve them into submission, that Berliners will eventually just say, you know what, it's cool, we'll become communist because we need to eat. So the question for the Allies is, how do they combat this? They can't forcefully go across the roads, right? Because they would be trespassing on East German or Soviet controlled territory. They don't want to start a war either. So what do you do when you can't supply a city by road? Well, you supply them by air. And so we have the Berlin airlift. This was a creative way where the Allies landed planes around the clock. Think of everything that a city needs to run, right? Fuel, medicine, clothing, technology, machinery. All of those things were flown in by the Allies to Berlin. This was a monumental task, but it just shows how vehemently the Western Allies were opposed to communism and how determined they were to keep West Berlin free and democratic. So the United States is feeling pretty good about themselves. They've had the success in Berlin. Stalin was unable to stop the Berlin airlift because, of course, that would mean declaring war, which he didn't want. And the US is like, okay, hey, we had this great big win, right? We slowed down the spread of communism. Success. Well, there's a new wrinkle in the plan to contain communism, which is in 1949, that August, when the Soviet Union develops its own atomic bomb. This is something that multiple sides in World War II were working on. The Americans, of course, were the first to develop. But due to its own program, due to spying, the Soviet Union just 4 years later is able to develop their own weapon. This, of course, changes the stakes for any potential conflict, right? Now the Soviet Union has the same destructive power that the United States does. To make matters worse, in 1949, there was also the communist takeover of mainland China. There had been a civil war going on where the nationalist government was fighting communist revolutionaries led by Mao Zedong. And the communists are successful. The nationalist government exiles itself, or they flee to Taiwan. And so the US now has not only the Soviet Union as a giant communist nation, but now China to contend with as well. So this really takes the wind out of the sails of the US, who was feeling great after Berlin. And now they're struggling with communist forces on two continents, on multiple fronts. We still hear about Taiwan today, right? Taiwan is a current flashpoint. Taiwan is still led by an ethnic Chinese government, but one that is democratic. And China, which is a communist nation still today, they look at Taiwan and basically China says to Taiwan today, no, you're really not free. We can take you over whenever we want to. And this is one of those current issues that we still look at in the world today as a potential huge global conflict. So, to combat the spread of communism, the Western allies, the democratic nations, they joined together in a group called NATO in 1949. 1949 was an eventful year, wasn't it? They're pledging to defend each other in the event of an attack by anybody else. This is an article that is only needed to be invoked one time, which was after September 11th. So, nearly 50 years later, after its inception, was the only time that the other nations came to the aid of, in this case, the United States. You can see on this map, the dark blue countries were the original NATO countries. NATO has since grown. It grew quickly at that time to include the light blue countries. And today it's even larger when communism, spoiler alert, when communism fails in the early 90s, eventually other groups join NATO. This is an issue today with Ukraine, where Ukraine wants to join NATO, but of course, Russia doesn't want that today. So it's interesting how some of these issues are still unresolved 70 years, more than 70 years later. Not to be outdone, right? The communist nations themselves, these 8 nations, they say, well, you know what? If there's a democracy club, we're going to have a communist club. And that group was the Warsaw Pact, which was founded. And they, like NATO, the Warsaw Pact members claim that they will support each other in any potential conflict. So when you look at all these alliances, you might be reminded of World War I, right? World War I started or became a global war because of alliances. And here we are in the mid 50s with the potential, right, for maybe a conflict between, say, Poland and West Germany to become a potential World War III. So 1949 ends, and we have another conflict, the first real war of the Cold War era. This is not directly between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it is with the United States helping out South Korea. So at the end of World War II, just like in Europe, the Soviet Union occupied one part of Korea, and the United States occupied another part. North Korea was a communist nation, no surprise, and South Korea was a democratic nation. And in 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. So North Korea is attempting to reunite one Korea under the banner of a communist government. The United States, of course, right, they can't have this. We're vowing to contain communism. So troops that were already there began fighting the North Koreans. The North Koreans were not on their own. They were helped not by the Soviet Union, but by communist China, who had just had, right, its own revolution before. And at the beginning, you can see from this map, things do not look great for the democratic side. You can see forces are almost pushed off the Korean Peninsula. The United States comes, they surge, and they almost go into China. So they turn the tides like almost 100%. There's a communist surge, and for the better part of 2.5 years or so, things are kind of stuck. If you compare the map on the left with the map on the right, things are almost the same for several years. And eventually, an armistice is signed in 1953. An armistice is basically a pause, it's like a ceasefire or a timeout. The unique thing about it is that a peace treaty was never signed. So technically, the Korean War never ended. It's just been on pause since 1953. And maybe it shows the futility of war. If you look at the left and the right images on the map, nothing really changed, right? In 3 years of war, all that death and bloodshed. Today, we know North Korea is still a communist nation led by Kim Jong un. It's unique if you've ever watched a documentary or looked at some YouTube videos for their lack of really development or progress. That dark space on this map is North Korea. North Korea, we can see, is still limited today by not having access to things like electricity. And so here's this unique image from the International Space Station that really shows China, which is industrialized, South Korea, which is industrialized, but really just the capital of North Korea that is lit up at night. One unique thing about the Korean War was that there was a disagreement over how to fight the war. General MacArthur is in charge of U.S. forces during the Korean War. He had been in Korea or Japan since World War II. He had never really come home other than maybe just for a quick visit. And so, one thing a top general can't do is disagree with the president publicly. MacArthur comes out, he says, Truman doesn't really know how to fight this war. Maybe we do need to go into China to take this war to China and potentially free China from communist rule. That's too much for Truman, and Truman relieves MacArthur of his command. MacArthur retires. He comes back to the U.S. for the first time and is seen as this war hero, which he was going back to World War II, to our actions in the Pacific. So he comes home to a hero's welcome. He thinks about running for political office, but at that point, he's really maybe just a little too old and just doesn't have the energy. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., the Korean War Memorial is a really unique memorial in that you get to walk through it, and so you see these soldiers that are out on patrol. It's a cool sight to see. Definitely worth checking out. So we talked about before that the Soviet Union in 1949 developed an atomic bomb. The U.S. develops a bigger and better bomb, or maybe a bigger and badder bomb is more apropos, and that's the hydrogen bomb. It's tested 3 years after the Soviets get their atomic bomb. This is 150 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We test these in the Pacific because there's really not a safe place, except maybe in the middle of the desert, to test it, but we don't want the radioactive fallout. The bomb is so powerful that the Pacific island it's tested on just disappears. It's obliterated. And the US is feeling pretty good about itself. But a year later, the Soviet Union develops its own hydrogen bomb. And so we have this arms race that really began in 1949 that will just continue with each nation trying to develop bombs that are bigger, more destructive to intimidate the other side. If you want to look at an interesting little side venture, if you Google nuke map, or you can type the website that you see on the screen, there is a site that has actually kept track of the destructive power of these weapons. You can choose them. You can put them on you can move them around on a map of the globe and see just how destructive they would be. It's pretty sobering to see if the newer bombs were placed somewhere in Texas, just how much of Texas, how multiple cities could be affected by just one bomb. So again, people at this time, they're really thinking, how how can we live with this? There was the real threat that a nuclear war could potentially end life as people knew it. Children in schools, not that ducking under a desk would do much good if the bomb was right next to you, perhaps if it was 50 miles away. But these air raid drills were commonplace in school. Another fun thing to search up on YouTube is Bert the Turtle. There's a catchy song, Duck and Cover, but you can really think about what were children having to wrestle with as they were right living through this time period. People themselves started developing or building bomb shelters in their own backyards, in their own basements, fortifying them, and people were right getting prepared for a very uncertain future. Another aspect, we had the arms race, but we're going to begin in the early Cold War to have a space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union puts the first satellite into space, and that is Sputnik 1. The US is working on our own space exploration, on our own satellites, but the fact that the Soviet Union beats us there, of course, is just a bad look. We don't want that. Sputnik didn't do anything other than emit some beeps and bloops, but there's the potential, right, of course, for what comes later on with satellites. Will there be weapons in space? Will they be able to spy on us, right? And so the space race is another outgrowth of the Cold War. We'll talk more about the space race when we get to the 1960s. So at home, there's a second Cold War. We talked about after World War One, there was the first Red Scare, excuse me. Now we're going to have a second Red Scare. And this is this fear that communists were hidden throughout society. Could they be in the government? Could they be in your churches, in your schools? Where are they? Could it be your neighbor? And so the government began questioning its own employees. People had to sign loyalty oaths. If we can see how many were investigated, how many were fired, and how many resigned. Maybe they resigned because they had communist ties, or maybe they resigned because they just didn't want to deal with it anymore. But this shows this fear coming to the United States. We briefly mentioned J. Edgar Hoover with the first Red Scare. This was before the FBI was even founded. Well, now here we are in the 1950s, and the FBI is a full-fledged organization. J. Edgar Hoover is the head. He will be the head for decades. And he comes up with a number. You can see that on the screen. He says that these communists are everywhere and that we need to find them. This will be echoed by somebody else in government who will say the same thing. The first group in government that's looking for communists is the House Un-American Activities Committee. That un-American activity that they're searching for, of course, is communism. They will investigate people in different industries, but they'll focus mainly on the movie industry. They call several producers, writers, directors, even actors before them, and they're saying, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Now, it's important to think about the fact just believing communism is a good form of government or being a member of the American Communist Party was not illegal. People have the freedom of thought, right? It's only illegal when you plan to overthrow a government, for example. However, in the post-war time period, being communism was, of course, looked on with great suspicion. So there are several actors, directors who are blacklisted. If you're blacklisted, that means you're put on a list, a literal list, and you're unable to work. 500 different people will be prevented from working either permanently or for a short time period during these investigations. One group of mainly producers was the Hollywood 10. They were called before Congress to testify, and they simply refused to answer the questions. They said, this is ridiculous. This is a witch hunt. I'm not going to answer these questions. They were held in contempt of Congress, and 10 of them actually went to jail for between 6 months and a year. And they stood up for their values, but they did pay a price. Some were forever banned from working in Hollywood. Others would work under pseudonyms or other names. where we have a political cartoon, right? Kind of making fun of this look for communism and kind of this all encompassing desire to find communists. There are a couple different spy trials that will captivate the nation. One is Alger Hiss. He worked for the State Department. He was accused by another admitted communist of being a communist himself. He denied these charges. He was kind of unique if you want to search the pumpkin papers. He literally had a hollowed out pumpkin where documents were exchanged in this pumpkin field. So they're called the pumpkin papers, which is kind of unique. He was unable to be convicted of spying because the statute of limitations had worn out. He was a spy, even though he maintained to the end his innocence. But he was convicted of perjury for lying to Congress, and he does spend 3 years in jail. So think about it, right? You have the House investigating, looking for communists. You turn on the news, you hear there's a communist in the State Department. Well, then you hear about that there are communists selling nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. And this involves a couple known as the Rosenbergs. They were implicated by a British scientist. They're not cool, but Julius's brother implicates them as well. They're convicted of selling these bomb secrets, and they're the first civilians in American history to be executed for espionage. The prior people, for espionage had been usually members of the government or the military, but these are private citizens. In real life, the brother and Julius probably were communist spies. Ethel, however, really was not. So even though she might have known that her husband was a spy, she herself did not sell these secrets or give these secrets. But again, you can think about Americans being fascinated and scared by, right? Here's just another example of communists in the government. And the person who most takes advantage of this for himself is a senator named Joseph McCarthy. He gives a speech, he gives several speeches actually, in which he claims to know that there are communists in the government. He's giving one speech, I believe in Virginia, and he holds up a stack of papers and he says, "In my hands, I have the names of 130 members of the government who are communists." People, of course, they want to know, right? Ooh, what's in that list? Tell us who, tell us more. He says, "Well, I can't show you the list. This is secret, but we're going to do some investigations." He gives more speeches. That number grows over time. Sometimes it goes down, sometimes it goes up. But he is going to hold these hearings that are televised on this new medium of television that's in people's living rooms for the first time by the mid-50s. And so again, people are able to tune in on TV or they see them on the news, and it really captures their attention. Oh my gosh, are there communists? McCarthy, however, he really didn't find any communists. He succeeded, however, in ruining the reputations and the lives of people who, right? Think about it, just to be accused, just to be called forth to testify is going to taint somebody with the suspicion. Today, when we talk about communism, right, we know that communism is no longer a threat to the American government, but it's hard to say just how much that fear pervaded American society for decades and decades. McCarthy himself, he will eventually go a step too far. He accuses several members of the military as being communists, which they were not. The President Eisenhower, of course, had been the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, and he kind of gives McCarthy a little lead, a little rope that ultimately McCarthy is going to use to sabotage his own career. McCarthy will eventually be viewed as a bully. He'll be forced out of Congress, and eventually he'll have kind of a sad ending to his life. It really just captures the fear, the fervor that pervades American society at this time. Thank you for watching this week. I'd like to acknowledge the people on the screen. This presentation was made by me. All rights are reserved.